I've been in the real estate business for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of weird houses. But nothing prepared me for the property on Willow Creek Road in Glenwood, Oregon. Nestled at the edge of a small town, this place had a reputation that preceded it. A sprawling Victorian mansion that sat vacant for years, the locals whispering about its dark history. I'm a skeptic, always have been. But this house, it challenged everything I thought I knew. The first time I saw it, I was struck by its beauty. Despite the overgrown garden and peeling paint, it had an undeniable charm. A couple from the city had asked my agency to list it, hoping for a quick sale. They'd inherited it from a distant relative and wanted nothing to do with it. As the most experienced agent, I was tasked with assessing the property. My job was to make it look appealing, despite the odd rumors. The exterior was quaint, but as soon as I stepped inside, an unsettling chill greeted me. It was midsummer and the sun blazed outside, yet the air inside was frigid. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot as I moved through the grand foyer, admiring the intricate woodwork and high ceilings. The house was massive, with 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, and each room seemed to hold a story of its own. As I ventured into the dining room, I noticed a large ornate mirror hanging on the wall. It was beautiful, but something about it felt off. The reflection seemed a little too crisp, too vivid, almost as if it were a portal to another world. I shook off the feeling and continued my walkthrough. I made notes of the renovations needed, repainting the walls, fixing some of the broken windows, and replacing a few loose floorboards. The last room on my list was the basement. I've never been a fan of basements, especially not in old houses like this one. But duty called, so I descended the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was huge, filled with old furniture and covered in dust. As I walked further in, I noticed a door at the far end, slightly ajar. Curious, I pushed it open to find a small, dimly lit room. The room was filled with old toys, a child's rocking chair, and an ancient crib. The sight of these forgotten relics sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, I felt a gust of cold air brush past me, and the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed back to the door, my heart pounding, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I fumbled with the doorknob, and that's when I heard it. A soft, childlike giggle coming from the darkness. I spun around, shining my flashlight in all directions, but saw nothing. My breath came in shallow gasps, fogging up the lens. The giggle came again, this time accompanied by the faint creak of the rocking chair. The room was empty, yet the chair was moving. I backed away, desperately trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a draft had caused the door to slam, and the chair, well, maybe it was just unsteady on the uneven floor. Just then a soft whisper filled the room, clear as day. "Come play with us." I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a chorus of children. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, though the thought did little to calm my nerves. With newfound urgency, I slammed my shoulder against the door. It finally gave way, and I stumbled into the basement. I didn't look back as I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. Back in the main house, I grabbed my things and rushed out, slamming the front door behind me. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the house, breathing heavily. That's when I saw it, in the upstairs window. A small face peering out at me. It was pale, with dark, hollow eyes. And then, it was gone. Shaken, I drove away, my mind racing. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the stories the locals had told me. They said that in the late 1800s, the house belonged to a wealthy family. The parents were strict and rarely let their children leave the house. The children's only solace was playing together in the basement. One night, a fire broke out. The parents managed to escape, but the children were trapped in the basement and never made it out. The house had been vacant ever since, save for a few short-lived owners who quickly left, claiming the place was haunted. I wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, a combination of creaky old wood and an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I experienced was real. I returned to the house the next day, determined to prove to myself that it was just a figment of my imagination. As I walked through the house, everything seemed normal, eerily so. But when I reached the basement, my heart stopped. The door to the small room was wide open, and inside the rocking chair sat still, as if waiting. I knew then that I couldn't list this house, not in good conscience. I called the couple and explained that the house needed more work than anticipated, and suggested they consider other options. They seemed relieved, as if they had expected something like this. I never went back, but sometimes, when I drive past Willow Creek Road, I catch a glimpse of that old mansion and wonder what really happened there. It's been years, and I've since moved on to other properties, but that house on Willow Creek Road stays with me, a lingering reminder that some places hold on to the past a little too tightly, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's best to leave the past undisturbed. It was about 20 years ago that I joined the real estate industry, in the hopes of selling my late great-aunt's home in the Spruceville area of Detroit. The home was this towering 2-story brick structure that was more or less a dump from years of neglect. My aunt had battled mental illness, so the house's disrepair was sad but not surprising given her struggles. There I was, on one of those sweltering summer days, the kind where the air feels thick like you're in a sauna. I was with Lila, a contractor buddy of mine, hashing out renovation plans for the first-floor family room. Out of nowhere, a bone-chilling draft swept through the room. Mind you, the AC was off, and outside the temperature was pushing 94 degrees. Weird, right? Lila thought the cold air might be a draft coming from the basement, so she went to investigate. Her footsteps faded into an echo as she descended the creaky stairs. 5 minutes ticked by, then 10. What was taking her so long? Finally, I decided I better go looking for her. I swung open the door to the basement stairwell and yelled down into the faint light that pierced the darkness below. "Lila, you okay down there?" The response was a guttural, unfamiliar voice that rasped, "Help me." My heart slammed against my rib cage. I flipped the light switch for the stairs, which of course didn't work. I bolted into the family room, grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox, and cautiously started a shaky descent down the stairs, all the while continuing to call out to Lila. I thought I heard a groan, but otherwise no response. When I hit the basement, a shiver coursed through my body. I scanned the room, half expecting some monster to jump out from the dark corners, but there was nothing like that. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, flickering like a dying star in a pitch-black universe. It cast eerie shadows that danced across the walls and along the stacks of old, rotting newspapers and forgotten family heirlooms. Rusted tools and broken furniture were strewn about, relics of a time long past. In one corner stood a decrepit boiler covered in layers of grime and rust, its dials and gauges long since frozen. Nearby, a wooden workbench lay cluttered with rusty nails, frayed electrical wires, and other remnants of failed repair projects. The whole place felt like a tomb, a hidden chamber where secrets were kept and forgotten, waiting for the right or wrong moment to resurface. But there was Lila, sprawled on her side, hands and feet bound, a rag stuffed in her mouth. She appeared unconscious. I untied Lila and pulled the rag from her mouth. She was still out cold. I sprinted upstairs, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The police and ambulance arrived within minutes. Lila woke up in the hospital with zero recollection of what had happened to her or who had called for help. Her medical tests came back inconclusive. The next day I returned to the godforsaken house, this time with my brother-in-law as backup. We scoured every inch looking for signs of a break-in, but found nothing. Just when we thought we were alone, a deafening crash echoed from the basement. We bolted downstairs and were hit by air so cold it felt like stepping into a meat locker, tinged with the acidic smell of sulfur. And then, right before our eyes, the strangest thing happened. Part of the basement floor gave way, revealing a perfectly square hole about 4 feet by 4 feet, looking like a gateway to God knows where. We'd left the flashlight upstairs, of course. My brother-in-law, ever the genius, reached into the hole. He yanked his hand back like he'd touched a live wire, saying he'd felt something like bone. "Call the cops," he stammered. "I think there's a dead body in there." In the coming days, the police unearthed not one but two bodies in that basement. My first thought was that it had to be my aunt's doing. She'd owned the home since she was 18 after her parents died in 1944. However, the medical examiners determined the bodies would have been killed by excruciating torture to the genital region and blunt force trauma around the same year her parents had died. But during that time, my aunt was overseas studying in Europe and didn't return to the States until 1947. To this day, nearly 2 decades later, we never did learn why parts of that house were so frigid, who had screamed for help, or if my aunt had been the murderer. It left my entire family mystified, raising questions that have never been answered. As for the house, we had no choice but to tear it down. Its foundation as rotten as its history. I've dealt with my fair share of challenging properties, but nothing could have prepared me for the house at the end of Maple Lane in Clearwater, Oregon. It was a charming, 2-story Victorian home with a wraparound porch and a quaint garden, the kind of place that should have been an easy sell. But for some reason it had sat on the market for over a decade. Rumors swirled around the place, strange noises, eerie shadows, but nothing concrete. The owners were desperate to sell, and I was confident I could finally get it off their hands. When I first arrived, I couldn't understand why the house hadn't sold. It was gorgeous, with vintage woodwork, stained glass windows, and spacious rooms. As I moved from room to room, I noticed something odd. The house seemed to have too many rooms for its listed size. I counted 5 bedrooms on the second floor, when the records clearly stated there were only 4. The strangest part was that one of the bedrooms had no windows, and no way to explain its existence based on the house's exterior dimensions. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, and the air was stale. Curious, I checked the house's blueprint again. Sure enough, the mysterious 5th room wasn't listed. I thought maybe the previous owners had made unauthorized renovations. It was a peculiar discovery, but not enough to scare off a determined realtor. I decided to investigate further, noting the room's location. Later, I mentioned the room to my colleague, Mark, who had been in the business longer than me. His face turned pale. "You found another one," he muttered, almost to himself. When I pressed him, he reluctantly told me a bizarre story. Over the years, every realtor who had taken on this property had reported finding extra rooms. The strange part? These rooms would disappear without a trace when someone else came to see them. But that wasn't the worst of it. The realtors who found these rooms often vanished, leaving the house's ownership in limbo. I laughed it off, thinking he was trying to spook me, but Mark was serious. He showed me records of at least 4 realtors who had gone missing after working with the property. "They say the house is cursed," he said. "It shows you things, lures you in, and then you're gone." Determined to prove the stories wrong, I decided to host an open house the following weekend. On the day of the event, I arrived early to set up. As I prepared the house, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house seemed different, almost as if it was waiting for something. The sun was shining outside, but inside, it felt like dusk. During the open house, a few interested buyers came and went, all of them impressed by the home's charm. I made sure to steer clear of the extra room story. No need to spook potential buyers with urban legends. Towards the end of the day, I realized no one had noticed the 5th bedroom. I decided to show it to the last couple, a young pair looking for a fixer-upper. But when we got to the second floor, the room was gone. I stared at the wall where the door had been just hours before. The couple looked at me, puzzled, as I stumbled over my words. Embarrassed, I made an excuse and ushered them out, promising to follow up later. After they left, I went back upstairs, determined to find the room. I ran my hands along the wall, looking for any sign of a hidden door. There was nothing. I even knocked on the walls, hoping to hear a hollow sound, but it was solid. Confused and frustrated, I decided to leave it for another day. As I was locking up, I heard a faint noise like a door creaking open. I turned, and there it was, the door to the mysterious room ajar. Heart pounding, I walked toward it. The room was just as I had seen it before, but now it felt different, almost inviting. I stepped inside and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed the walls. They were covered in photographs, old and yellowed. As I looked closer, my breath caught in my throat. The photos were of people, all standing in front of this very house, and in every picture, the same room was visible through a window, the same room that shouldn't exist. The faces in the photos were smiling, but their eyes looked vacant, hollow. Among the photos, I saw a familiar face. It was Mark, the colleague who had warned me. He looked younger, but it was unmistakably him. I stared horrified as I realized the implications. The room. It wasn't just a room, it was a trap, a portal to... I didn't know where. All I knew was that everyone who had found this room was now gone, their images preserved in these eerie photographs. Panicked, I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. I rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and I felt a presence, something malevolent, closing in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. As the room darkened, I felt myself being pulled away, the walls around me shifting. I knew then that I was about to join the others. In a last desperate attempt, I screamed, "No!" and with a burst of adrenaline, kicked at the door. It flew open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The door behind me slammed shut and disappeared into the wall, leaving no trace it had ever been there. I ran out of the house, not looking back, and drove away as fast as I could. I never returned to that house on Maple Lane. I quit my job at the agency and moved away, leaving the real estate business behind. The house was eventually sold to an out-of-town investor who had no knowledge of its history. I sometimes wonder what became of it, and if anyone else found the mysterious room. I'd been a real estate agent in Vermont for more than 10 years when I got a call from my old friend Alice. Alice needed help selling her house out in a little town called Mapleton. For those who don't know Mapleton, it's this charming, quintessential New England town near the Green Mountains in western Vermont. Alice had been through a lot recently. Her mom had battled cancer and ultimately died in that house. The following night, her father, distraught from her death, got plastered, accidentally tripped, and fell down a steep hill while walking their dog. The dog survived, but her dad didn't. He broke his neck and died. A few months later, I was doing a preliminary check on the house's condition. Everything seemed normal until, out of nowhere, a knife literally leaped out of the kitchen silverware drawer, heading right for my foot. I jumped back and narrowly avoided a trip to the ER. I brushed it off as a freak accident and finished my inspection. Later that day, a fierce snowstorm swept through Mapleton, essentially closing down the main road out of town. I called Alice, and she reluctantly allowed me to stay in the house. There was one condition, though. Sleep wherever you want, but don't even think about crashing in my parents' room. The house tends to make some weird noises during snowstorms, and it can get pretty darn loud, she said. It had something to do with the pipes running under the bedroom's floor. Sure enough, around 3 a.m., I began to hear the noises, but they weren't just regular pipe noises. They sounded more like someone moaning in agony. A deep voice, like something straight out of a horror movie, made my skin crawl. I didn't need a second invitation. I bolted out of the house and spent the rest of that freezing night in my car. The next morning, I woke up to find scratch marks all along the side of my car. Inside, the house was trashed, just destroyed, with no signs of a break-in anywhere. I dialed the police and then called Alice, explaining everything that had happened. With all the weirdness going on, and me somehow becoming a person of interest, I decided it was time to hand this listing over to my partner back at the office. But that's when things took an even stranger turn. A week later, Alice called me in the middle of the night from a rest stop, sounding utterly terrified. "I'm not sure how I got here," she told me over the phone. She rambled incoherently for a few moments, making no sense. but from what I was able to gather, she had sleepwalked an astonishing 5 miles to reach that rest stop. I drove out to pick her up, thinking she'd lost her mind when she dropped this bombshell on me. She said, "You remember those strange sounds coming from the water pipes I mentioned?" Well, I don't think it's the pipes. Call me crazy, but I think this house is haunted. My grandfather used to rant about it before he died mysteriously from a heart attack, and I'm starting to believe it's the same reason my dad fell down that hillside. I stared at her, speechless, not knowing how to process all this. We arrived back at her house. At this point, I'm debating whether I need to get my friend a shrink or just get her out of there. Finally, I suggested to her, "Hey, let's spend the night at my place." All of a sudden, the floor started trembling, and a bone-chilling voice echoed through the hallways shouting, "Get out!" Alice didn't react. She just went about her business like nothing happened. Well, I freaked out and just ran for my car. I drove home, slept it off, and called Alice the next day. When I brought up the crazy events from the night before, she was like, "What are you talking about? You came over, we played cards, and you left." Nothing unusual happened. She didn't remember sleepwalking. She didn't remember calling me from the rest stop. And she didn't remember the floors shaking. She was completely oblivious to everything that had happened. After that conversation, I never heard from Alice again. A year passed, and then I stumbled upon her obituary in the news. She had died from a brain aneurysm at the young age of 35. That day, I decided to take a long break from the real estate industry and went on a sabbatical. I'm not sure whether she went crazy, I went crazy, or that house was truly haunted. And I'm not sure I'll ever get those answers.